We've got to figure out how to keep the farmers growing it. We've got to figure out how to keep them feeding it to their animals, and also making sure that they themselves get to eat and continue having a living. Again, commoditizing those waste products, stabilizing that supply chain, giving them alternative sources of income from that one crop is really my goal.
That's Hunter Buffington, Executive Director of the Hemp Feed Coalition. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock. And today I'll talk to Hunter Buffington about the work the Hemp Feed Coalition is doing in order for hemp to win approval and acceptance as a livestock feed. We'll talk about the benefits of hemp as a feed, what it's going to take to get government approval, just how big the potential market is, and a whole lot more. But first, let's check in on some nuggets of hemp news. Hello and welcome back. Hope you all are doing well in this new year. I took the last few weeks off from the show, so I guess we have a little catching up to do news-wise. Sure, we could talk about the spiking coronavirus numbers, or the treasonous insurrection in Washington last week, maybe the impending impeachment of what's-his-name, or even the fact that Mitch McConnell will soon be the Senate Minority Leader.
Industrial hemp.
But this is a show about hemp, so let's talk about hemp news instead. Did you hear about the lawsuit between Canopy Growth and GW Pharmaceuticals? Eric Sandy at hempgrower.com writes that Canopy Growth Corporation, one of the largest cannabis producers in the world, filed a federal lawsuit in late 2020 against GW Pharmaceuticals, the UK-based cannabis business behind the FDA-approved Epidiolex. At issue is an extraction method that Canopy asserts is newly protected by patent. Canopy Growth alleges that GW Pharmaceuticals produces Epidiolex via the protected CO2 extraction method. Since its 2018 approval from the FDA, GW then distributes Epidiolex across the US and elsewhere at $1,235 per 100 milliliter bottle. GW reported approximately $366 million in net product sales of Epidiolex in the United States in the first 9 months of 2020, according to the lawsuit. I'll have a link to the full story and all the other news nuggets that I'm about to talk about on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. Here's another one from Hemp Grower. Improved THC testing could be ready by the end of 2021. The federal government is developing more accurate methods to assess THC levels in a move expected to benefit both hemp growers and law enforcement. The story was written by Stephen Langle, who says, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce, is developing more reliable methods to distinguish hemp from its legal counterpart in the state licensed cannabis market, and aims to have these methods fully developed or evaluated by the end of the year. This effort is one part of NIST's cannabis program, which includes a cannabis quality assurance program to help, in part, assess cannabidiol levels in CBD products and to develop reference materials. All right, here's a fascinating story out of Humboldt County, California, from the Times Standard, published last week and written by Isabella Vander Heeden. The Humboldt County Planning Commission will consider a permanent ban on industrial hemp cultivation in the county. The proposed ordinance before the commission would replace the temporary moratorium currently in place and permanently ban the cultivation of industrial hemp in Humboldt County. If passed, the new regulations would apply throughout the unincorporated areas of Humboldt County, including the coastal zone. An extension to the temporary moratorium on industrial hemp cultivation was reestablished by the Board of Supervisors during its December 8, 2020 meeting and is set to expire on May 10, 2021. During the meeting, a few supervisors and several in public comment voiced their concern that industrial hemp cultivation could negatively affect commercial cannabis crops. There is also a lot of concern around cross-pollination, says Humboldt County Growers Alliance Policy Director Ross Gordon during the December 8th meeting. We're seeing a lot of unstable genetics with hemp. Those unstable genetics create concerns, as well as the scale of hemp production, about potential cross-pollination and losing the thing we have here that is so unique, which is the cannabis industry. All right. Here's a story that's almost a month old, but it's worth mentioning because it could have had a profound effect on the hemp industry, and maybe it still will. Kentucky's other senator, Republican Rand Paul, last month introduced legislation called the Hemp Economic Mobilization Plan Act, That's an acronym in case you missed it. This so-called Hemp Act, according to Senator Paul's Twitter feed, will help this growing industry reach its full economic potential. It would amend the definition of hemp from 0.3% to 1% THC. It would require testing of hemp-derived products rather than the hemp flower or plant itself. It would create transparency and certainty by defining a margin of error in hemp testing. And it would require the inclusion of a seed certificate copy when transporting hemp from farms to processing facilities to certify the hemp was grown from seed containing 1% THC on a dry weight basis. Okay, that last one doesn't make sense to me because I was under the impression that hemp seed didn't contain any THC, but that's what Randy's got on his Twitter feed. Do they call him Randy? I don't know. From what I understand, though, this proposal will be dead once the new Congress is seated, but perhaps Senator Rand Paul will try again.
Industrial hemp.
Closer to home, the Pennsylvania Farm Show is underway this week, and as hempgrower.com reports, Pennsylvania state officials will be working to bring attention to hemp during its annual farm show, including a presentation for students about hemp plastic as a sustainable material. There you go. There was also a virtual panel discussion with the Pennsylvania Hemp Steering Committee this week at the farm show, which was held virtually this year due to the pandemic. Last year, we recorded our very first episode of 2020 live at the Pennsylvania Farm Show, and it's such a great event. I miss being there. Hopefully next year will be normal. Okay, here's a story out of Alabama. Hemp Industry Daily reports that Bastcore, an Alabama-based hemp fiber company, has turned a former steam plant outside the capital city of Montgomery into a processing facility, one of the first in the U.S. to offer a key link in the supply chain between Alabama's farmers and hemp-derived product makers. So I'm going to try to get the folks at Bastcore on the phone and see when this facility will be fully operational. All right, here's a story from Futurism.com. I don't think this is news, but maybe just an example of creative hemp marketing. The headline reads, "These hemp flower cigarettes can help you kick your nicotine habit. Oklahoma smokes are tobacco-free, nicotine-free, additive-free, and non-addictive." So there you go, hemp cigarettes being marketed as a way to quit tobacco. So I smoked cigarettes from 1987 to 2001, and if I can quit, you can quit. It's really worth the struggle. And if hemp cigarettes can help you get there, then more power to you. I believe in you. All right, some other news from the USDA. The USDA announced on January 8th the approval of hemp production plans under the U.S. Domestic Hemp Production Program for Rhode Island and the Saboba Band of Luiseno Indians, bringing the total number of approved plans to 72. All right, one last thing. Maybe you remember me talking about the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit? Well, if you missed the summit itself, you can still experience it online. The Pennsylvania Hemp Summit virtual platform will be available until March 1st, 2021. Previously registered attendees require no further registration, just log on and enjoy. For new attendees, registration is $99 for general admission or $50 for students and Pennsylvania hemp permit holders. Also, the summit organizers were planning a trade show and reception at the end of March this year in Lancaster, but that event has been pushed back to early November. I'm sure I'll have some more details about that in the future, but you can go to pahempsummit.com to learn more about it. All right, so those are my hemp news nuggets for today. I'll have links to all of these stories on the show page for this episode at lancasterfarming.com. If you have any dank nuggets of news to share with me, please send them along to podcast@lancasterfarming.com. Okay, so my guest today is Hunter Buffington. She is the executive director at the Hemp Feed Coalition. Here we go. Hunter Buffington, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great. Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. Could you give us a brief introduction, please?
Absolutely. My name's Hunter Buffington. I'm the executive director for the Hemp Feed Coalition. We are a national and now international organization focused on gaining legal federal approval for hemp and hemp byproducts as animal feed ingredients. And our secondary mission is to open new markets that support farmers through this work as well.
All right, so let's sort of define hemp as a livestock feed. What parts of the plant are we talking about, and what animals would be eating it?
That is a really great question. I'm going to kind of break that into two parts. So the first thing to consider is that most agricultural commodities, through their processing, produce byproducts. And those byproducts often have some sort of animal or nutritional application, and hemp is no different. Right now, we're focused primarily on the oilseed products and byproducts. So as we crush the oilseed, primarily for oil that goes into the human food market, one of the many byproducts is hulls, which there's a lot of opportunity and promise as a swine feed. Then we also have the extruded seed meal, sometimes pelletized or cake material, that has a really incredible nutritional profile and a lot of applications potentially for ruminants, as well as horses and other livestock, even poultry. And then, of course, we have, the components that come from cannabinoid production, which is the post-extracted pulp material. And there's potentially opportunities even on the fiber side of it, depending on how we go through that processing. So really, our goal is to take a look at those byproducts. And when I say take a look, we're going to look at them for their nutritional composition, for any contaminant concerns, and then identify how they could potentially be used for those animals and what species would benefit from being fed that material.
And so what do you think some of the benefits would be for using hemp as a feed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about two different byproducts just to make it a little bit easier for myself to talk about it, and then also to give your listeners just scratching the surface of what the real potential is. So when we're looking at that extruded material that comes from crushing the seed, the nutritional composition is around 30% of protein and 10% of residual fats. When you compare that to other potential animal feed products, and remember that this is a byproduct, oftentimes just a waste material, it has an incredible opportunity to be used as a protein supplement. That's something that we're using for poultry right now, laying in broilers, as well as looking at a protein supplement for ruminants. Then another thing that we've been looking at is the filtrate. And what that is that's the sediment material that it remains after the oil has been extracted. So this really just settles to the bottom. It's an incredible source of omega-369 fatty acids and is a wonderful potential top dress for horses or other animals that need more calories. So if you think about your cow-calf operation when you've got those moms feeding their babies. So there's just a couple of opportunities there.
And so why aren't people already feeding hemp to animals? I mean, I guess that's sort of a loaded question. I know part of the answer is that hemp's been illegal for 80 years up until 2 or 3 years ago.
It's a loaded question, but it's the one that I get asked most often now. When I started this job 3 years ago, the most common question that I got was, is it going to get my cows high? And it's wonderful that we as an industry and as a culture have moved past that question. But now it's the question that you just asked that I get most often. And it's asked with a lot of kind of shock and horror, if you will, as to why it's still not available for animal feed. The reason it goes back way before our Food and Drug Administration really started managing a lot of our food ingredients. And it's the FDA and the Center for Veterinary Medicine that's responsible for the approval of animal feed ingredients. And so when that organization was formed, it happened during our prohibition on cannabis, which of course, in fact, affected the hemp industry as well. So once we came out of prohibition, it's like starting all over again. we have to take a look at industrial hemp that's produced in the United States. We can only present information to FDA CVM for that hemp that's not only grown in the United States, but then also processed in the United States. And we also have to conduct our clinical feed trials in the US as well. So in spite of the fact that we've been feeding this material for millennia and eating it ourselves for millennia around the world, it's still a very specific process that we have to go through. And I don't think it would be shocking for me to say that the FDA hasn't been particularly comfortable with this plant. So we have a long ways to go. And then to add to that, not only do we have to do all of that homogeneity profile, looking at just the plant itself, but that's for every single byproduct. So we have to do that for hemp seed oil meal, for oil itself, for the filtrate, for the hulls, for the pulp material. And then you add on top of that, we also have to do a safety assessment for each species for the intended use and purpose of that feed, for its inclusion rate, and then for the category of animals. And that goes back to, is this a production animal, or is this a cow calf, or a breeding animal that's going through the process? So it's quite complex, very time consuming, and of course that also means expensive.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like you just need an army of scientists and veterinarians and farmers to work this out.
Yeah, it's an incredible group effort, because we not only need the farmers to be willing to grow it so that we can test it and make sure that it's consistent across the United States, but you're right, we need those veterinary toxicologists. We also need people like myself that really love data and want to look at all of those data points and turn it into a model or a table that is attractive and understandable.
That's great. So it's not like something that could be worked out legislatively. It's already like it would be a policy decision in one of the in the FDA.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that question, Eric, because that in fact is what led to the formation of the Hemp Feed Coalition back in 2017, and I'm in Colorado, that's where we were born. The Colorado legislature did in fact try to pass legislation to allow for hemp byproducts to be fed to animals. We quickly found out that that wasn't actually a viable pathway. And so that was instead turned into a stakeholder study. And that stakeholder study, there's a report on our website, hempfeedcoalition.org. You can see what came out of that stakeholder study group. And it was literally a pathway and a process to gain federal legal approval. And at the conclusion of that stakeholder group, there was a real desire to keep doing that work and move us forward. And that's how the Hemp Feed Coalition was born. A lot of states are still trying to push forward with legislation, but the reality is that there's only one way that we can do it, and that's through FDA CVM. Now, my hope is that we can get to a place where we can present them with enough data and resources to show that it is consistent, that it doesn't have real safety concerns as far as just its contamination component, and that we'll be able to move forward faster with multiple applications, or at least multiple species on an application for one ingredient. That will be one way that we can hopefully speed up the process. But it usually takes 4 years to get the approval. I still cringe every time I say that. But the FDA CVM is experiencing some, we'll say, pressure. There's a lot of enthusiasm for getting this done. And so we've been told that there's interest in fast tracking our application approval. And by fast track, that means 18 to 24 months.
It's better than 4 years, though, right?
It is better than 4 years.
Yeah. Do you think a change in the administration in the executive branch would help your cause?
I think it will in a couple of ways. The first one is that we need enough staff at FDA CVM to be able to process at speed these applications. And, our first submission was hemp seed meal for laying hens. That submission is almost 500 pages long, and that's almost all data rather than the narrative itself. So you can imagine how long it takes for a veterinary toxicologist to go through all of that information. So I think that's one thing that will help is having some more resources and just scientists that are engaged with FDA CVM. I am also hoping that there is recognition in this new administration that not only do our farmers need additional streams of revenue, and commoditizing waste products is a fantastic way to stabilize a supply chain and keep the farmers in the game, but also that there needs to be some impetus put on FDA in general to move through this process and help us get regulatory approval and regulatory oversight, not just the approval, but that we know that our consumers and our animals are safe. And I think we've done a really great job of setting that precedent for the first time. Obviously, there's so many applications and so many species to move through that it would be incredibly helpful if there was also some emphasis put on speed at which we can get this done. How can we work with the federal agencies to make this happen?
Right. Apart from the sort of policy challenges, what other challenges does the hemp for livestock feed industry face?
Yeah, so I think really there's a couple, and most of them are around the apparent newness of this crop. So we don't understand really well what geographical implications or varietal differences have on the nutritional composition for this plant. There's still a real need to do just general research and learn more about this plant. I think one of the areas that is really exciting for me that we really haven't yet scratched the surface on, or just beginning to scratch the surface, is if we're utilizing this plant as a phytoremediative plant, then where do we have concerns for any of those contaminants? And what I mean by that is, if we're going to use a fiber crop for remediation of heavy metals or of residual pesticides, does that mean that those materials are in the oil seed itself, or are they in just the plant material? Those bits of information are going to give us a lot of guidance on how we could still utilize that material downstream. Mm-hmm. And that's very exciting. I think the other thing, as far as, gaps in knowledge, again, is how do we feed it? What are all of the opportunities? I mentioned that the hulls, there's a lot of excitement around feeding just the hulls to swine and the kind of implications that it has for replacing a specific carbohydrate in their diet. These are things that we're just really now learning. There's also great enthusiasm for what small amounts of cannabinoids, the kind of impact it could have, in fact, on fertility. So there's just so much potential opportunity, even in getting to know this plant. I think that's also one of our issues, because when USDA says to us, we want you to guarantee that this plant's not going to go hot, or guarantee a varietal that's not going to go hot, that is probably the easiest way to understand how little we really do know about this plant and the way that it functions. For me, that's exciting, but we've got to figure out how to keep the farmers growing it. We've got to figure out how to keep them feeding it to their animals, and also making sure that they themselves get to eat and continue having a living. So again, commoditizing those waste products, stabilizing that supply chain, giving them alternative sources of income from that one crop is really my goal.
How big is the potential market?
Yeah, that is, it's one of those moving targets. And the reason I say that is only because as we discover more ways that we can feed this material, it opens up new potential opportunities. When we think about protein replacement for poultry, just in the United States, that's a tens of billions of dollar industry. The aquaculture industry is really enthusiastic about a protein replacement. Right now they use fish meal for a lot of the aquaculture. I wish everyone could see your face when I said that, Eric, because yeah, exactly. It's kind of yucky. So if we can get to a place where we can really present those opportunities for protein replacement, then we start to make huge inroads as far as those markets. And that's not even considering, the equine market is the biggest segment in the animal industry. Early adopters, they also take great care of their horses, so they're much more willing to try new materials and pay for those if they work. And we're seeing really amazing results for horses, especially when we look at inflammation and hoof health when they're being fed any of these additives, especially if they need to top dress that oil or filtrate that I mentioned before. So these are million, if not billion-dollar segments in and of themselves. And one thing that I can share with your listeners is that in a conversation with a well-known feed distributor here in the United States, it was posed to me that the amount of hemp seed meal that they would need to mix into just their laying hen feeds, so just one category of hens, was 500 tons of meal each month.
Wow.
So to give it a perspective, and we've talked a little bit about what the actual cost of this material is, and that's one of those things that we're going to have to figure out as supply and demand begin to meet.
Yeah. Now, our farmers could meet that demand, though, right?
When you look at the number of acres that's currently being grown in the United States, it's not the acreage that's being grown that is the problem for meeting those demands. It's the processing of that material. So the way that I would answer that is, we've had a small decline in the number of farmers and the number of acres when we had the market correction a couple of years ago. I guess it was just last year, but as we move forward within the next 2 to 3 years, processing should come online to be able to manage all the acreage that's being grown and then actually deliver that supply to industry for the feed distribution and for the rations. Mm-hmm. It's not long.
Right. I've heard about a few processing projects around the country, and that's exciting because that's what we need. We need to build that infrastructure around the supply chain.
That's exactly what's missing.
Yeah. Here in Pennsylvania, dairy farmers seem very interested in industrial hemp. Where are the dairy farmers in sort of like the process of policy change? I'm not even sure how to ask that, but what can we tell dairy farmers?
Absolutely. I have had some really amazing conversations with some dairy producers, primarily in Pennsylvania, in fact. And the enthusiasm that they have for it's really interesting because it's not only on the meal side, but it's also on the forage and silage side of industrial hemp. So I think that's exciting because the dairy industry has not only the opportunity to drive that kind of innovation, just because it provides so much of a food source for us, but also because if they can identify ways to keep their herds as healthy as possible, as fertile as possible, and with the highest productivity as far as milk production as possible, and they can say that this is helped and an advantage comes from feeding industrial hemp, that would be an incredible way to move the industry forward. An interesting thing as well with the dairy industry is that one of the few studies that really looked at the amount of cannabinoids that can be consumed by humans. And remember that this is a long-term problem for us, because just because we prove that it's safe to feed to the animal doesn't mean that the animal byproduct is then safe for human consumption. So I bring this up because the European Food Safety Association did a study a few years ago looking at cannabinoids in milk and determined that it was in fact safe for everyone above the age of 2 who wasn't primarily consuming milk. So I do think that the dairy industry not only has an opportunity to help drive that forward, but they are also in a great position to have those conversations with their constituents, the people that are buying their milk. And I also love the way that they really invest in their animals. They really want them to be as healthy as possible.
Mm-hmm. Last year, I interviewed Dr. Joe Bender from Penn Vet about feeding, about some of the studies that they were doing with feeding hemp, and he seemed to be concerned with the digestibility in dairy cows, with hemp as a forage. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that there has not been nearly enough studies. I think that is one of the issues that we've run into that could be very specific to varietals. We know, especially on the fiber types, that we have those short and long fibers. And it's my understanding that those short fibers are really compact and not easily digested. So that is something for us to definitely take a look at. And it makes it more interesting to consider if there's really digestibility or nutritive differences between that silage and forage material. And it takes us right back to that question of, what's the intended use? Because there's a lot of opportunity for protein supplementation or fat supplementation, but that's one area that we really haven't gotten into the research yet with enough data that I would even be comfortable to speculate.
Sure.
Is looking at those carbohydrates and that digestibility, especially rumen digestibility. That's a science in and of itself.
All right. Okay. What can farmers do to help you with your cause?
Yeah, I think really talking about it, understanding where we are in the legal process, and they don't necessarily need to know how we got here, but to really understand that it is a long process, that anecdotal evidence is important for us, especially when we look at that forage and silage material as we're venturing into new uses and applications, hearing from our farmers about how much they feed, or if they feed it, why they do or why they don't, is helpful for us. Now, you cannot have a product, an animal product, enter the stream of revenue if it's been hemp fed. So I really want to caution my farmers and producers about that. I don't want them to find themselves in a position where they have yet more waste that they can't put into the stream of commerce. But finding out, especially when I was talking about the horse industry, those are not products going into the animal food market. So it's been easier to do those kind of anecdotal studies and discover, the benefits from feeding that. I think the other thing is where we can actually affect policy with our legislators is to also educate them what this looks like. There's a huge opportunity, though, to have them help us fund clinical trials through their land-grant universities, having conversations with their extension agents. That's something that the farmers can really help us do, is to let their extension agents know that they're interested in this and that they want to support these kinds of research projects. And then the other thing is, reach out to me and let me know if you've got policymakers that need education or that are really fantastic supporters. If you know your state feed control officer or official, have a conversation with them and start really increasing that dialogue so that we're on the same page. And then maybe next year it'll be a different question that I get asked all the time, right?
Right. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Hemp Feed Coalition itself? Like, who is it a coalition of? Who are your people?
I love that question. So, as I mentioned, we started here in Colorado from that stakeholder study group, but that the stakeholders that were brought together for that particular study were from across the United States and Canada. And it's that Canadian involvement that makes us an international organization. But obviously, Canada's had a little bit of a head start when it comes to growing industrial hemp. But shockingly, even in Canada, they have also not been able to gain federal legal approval to feed hemp or its byproducts to their animals. So there was a real opportunity for us to work together to get that done. But we do have those veterinary toxicologists. We've got extension agents that are involved that came from that stakeholder group. The president of the National Animal Supplements Council is part of our board and came to us from that stakeholder group, as well as farmers and livestock producers. We really want to make sure that we are a coalition of farmers and producers first and foremost, so that when we get this legal approval, we can meet our second objective, which is that, commoditization and opening new markets. But I'm very excited to be able to say that we really do represent and have representatives from multiple industries, not just the hemp industry, that are involved with the Hemp Feed Coalition.
Yeah. So is there a way that listeners could join your organization?
Absolutely. And I would invite anyone that has an interest in animals or industrial hemp to become a member of the Hemp Feed Coalition. Membership is inexpensive. We want to encourage as much diversity and participation as we possibly can. So it's just $100 a year. You can go right to our website. If you donate $100, we'll automatically make you a member. You'll get member-specific communications and invitations to join work groups if you're interested. And then there's also special discounts and offers. For example, a 15% discount at Eurofins Biosciences, Biodiagnostics for our members that need to do compliance or lab testing on their materials. But members are how we can in fact call ourselves a coalition. Can't do this work without them. So I would love to invite anyone if they have questions or would like to join us to do that as soon as they can.
Cool. I'll put a link to that on the show page for this episode. Now, how about you? Do you have a background in agriculture? Like what's your personal connection to livestock?
Yeah, so it's funny because if you'd have told my 22-year-old self graduating from university that I was going to find myself in ag at this point in my career, I definitely would have scoffed at you. But I grew up in Wyoming, and I always make jokes that I grew up chasing cows. But anybody that's ever actually pushed cows knows that you don't chase cows. It's always one. It's one cow that won't go where it's supposed to go. I do not have a green thumb, so I really rely on my farmers for my own ability to feed myself when it comes to that. But I also trained performance horses, hunter jumpers, and dressage horses when I was younger. So I definitely have that animal feed industry background. Ironically, I came to hemp working on sustainable development and renewable resources. So that was really my introduction to hemp. And then the more time that I spent learning about it, obviously, 30,001 uses, it's kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy where you start to learn about something and it just turns into a rabbit hole, and there's almost no way to stop because everywhere you turn, there's some sort of application. And I was the executive director for the Colorado Hemp Industries Association. And in that role, I was invited to participate in the stakeholder group. And that's really what started it all off. And then Hemp Feed Coalition had enough of a reason and its own mission and support to become its own entity in 2019.
Cool. All right. So let me ask you this. Do you think the marijuana stigma matters anymore?
Absolutely. And I would say that there's two sides to that coin. One side is the negative coin, of, is it going to get my cows high? I still get asked that question, just not as often. I think there's great concern about THC, and with great concern, unfortunately, with the lack of scientific evidence, there's a lot of misunderstanding of that compound. As we learn more about all of the cannabinoids, there's also a huge opportunity for more confusion as we just learn more about this plant. One thing that I would say about the marijuana industry, and really a snapshot of where we are in the cannabis industry right now, is that I would really encourage our policymakers, our farmers out there to take a moment and understand that it's all cannabis sativa L. And there are many ways at which the marijuana side of the industry and the hemp side of the industry could absolutely help each other. A great example of that is looking at the kind of biomass that we need to actually move forward with biodegradable plastics. There's not enough biomass coming from the fiber sector of the plant industry. There's no reason that we couldn't be using the material, the stems and stalks from marijuana production to get to those biomass numbers. If we really want houses built with hemp, if we really want these bioplastics, we've got to get to a critical mass of this material. There's ways for us to play together and really change our world. So I would love to see that happen in the future, that we can, maybe be friends, at least figure out how to help each other in the supply chain.
Sure. What do you think it's going to take to get sort of like, masses of consumers to demand products made from sustainable, regenerative agriculture?
Yeah. There's a couple things. I think the first one is to openly address the stigma. As you mentioned, there's still a lot of confusion and concern. I haven't heard this, but it wouldn't surprise me for someone to say, is your hemp shirt going to get me high? It's amazing the kind of misinformation that is out there. I think the other thing that we can really work on as well is identifying what is that critical mass and how do we get it in people's hands at a price point that they can afford. I think we also have a huge opportunity. So many people, I mentioned that I met hemp, if you will, through renewable energy and sustainable development. But how many people have come to a point where they feel like climate change is insurmountable, that they as an individual simply can't impact or help save our planet or sequester carbon on their own? And I think that's a really unique opportunity that we have in the hemp industry, is that through the way that you build your house or through the car that you buy, the plastics that you use, we can actually start to move that dial. But we also have to get to that place where we're creating enough biomass to bring the price down. And, it's a double-edged sword, because this is a specialty crop for a lot of folks. And so it's worth the extra amount to pay for it because you believe in the crop. But if we're really going to take this plant to the masses, we've got to find a happy medium where supply meets demand and it's cost effective for the end user, but still, again, feeds our farmers and keeps them growing it.
Amen to that. So what else should we know? What else can you tell us?
Let me just share with you guys where we're at right now with applications, because I'm really excited. It's difficult. We've talked a lot about the barriers and why we're at a point in our history with this plant that it's still not legally approved. But I want to share with you and your listeners some high points as far as how we're moving this project forward. So the Hemp Feed Coalition, along with a number of our constituents, has submitted an application to AFCO. This is the American Association of Feed Control Officials for a new ingredient approval for hemp seed meal for laying hens. This is the first submission of its kind. So I'm very excited to let everybody know that officially it's been submitted, and AFCO is going to look over it. That'll start the process, and then it will go on to FDA CVM for their consideration. We are also working with a group of researchers to put forth an application for hemp seed meal for ruminants. This would be beef cattle, goats, and sheep. So that's exciting, because our goal there is to put a number of species together in this one application, see if we can build that kind of palette for FDA CVM as we move forward. And then we're also looking at hemp seed oil for horses. The meal applications have been funded. That's pretty exciting. We are looking for some champions to help us get this oil for horses funded. But we're absolutely moving forward, and our goals for 2021 is to get 2 more submissions, hopefully those multi-species groups together, and really start pushing this forward and give farmers some markets.
All right, good. All right, so I understand that hemp has, great nutritional potential, for animals. How do they feel about eating hemp? Do the horses like to eat hemp?
Yeah, so the horse cookies made out of the meal seem to be a huge favorite. I haven't seen any horses that don't just love them. Some of the funny stories that I've heard about hemp is in trying to feed whole seed hemp to cows, they weren't particularly excited about it because, of course, it would stick to their noses. They couldn't actually eat it. But one of the things that we're finding as we go through clinical trials is that there's a certain amount of any one feed ingredient where they start to back off and say, I really want some more diversity. So we're absolutely seeing that in hemp. It's not the kind of thing where you're going to feed only hemp. We're seeing between 20 and up to as much as 30% inclusion. So if we think about that, a third of their feed ration being a hemp meal or some sort of hemp is quite high. So we feel like the palatability is not an issue, although at 20%, some species really kind of start to go, I'm not so excited about that. But that's really only in meal and oils. We haven't had the opportunity to make those same kind of inferences looking at that forage and silage material that we talked about. I will say that it does seem that they like the pulp material as well. So that's that post-extracted leftover biomass is what a lot of people call it. So they seem to be pretty enthusiastic about that as well, species-wide. I haven't seen any species that don't want it.
Great. Well, Hunter Buffington, it is so wonderful to talk to you today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
All right, that's the show for today. We did it. We made our first show of 2021. You know, there's a lot to be pessimistic about in this world, but I was a pessimist for a long time, and I found it wasn't working for me, so I switched to optimism. All right, and I'm optimistic about a lot of things going into this year. But there's great things on the horizon for the hemp industry. There's great things on the horizon for this hemp podcast, and I'm just putting it out there that I'm hoping there's great things on the horizon for you too. So thank you very much for listening to our show. My name is Eric Herlock. I am the digital editor at Lancaster Farming newspaper. Say it with me, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. It's no joke. Check us out. Get yourself a subscription. Go to lancasterfarming.com. You can learn all about it. Also, follow us on the Instagram at LF Podcast Hemp. You can always reach out to me at podcast@lancasterfarming.com, and be sure to check out the show page for links to the hempfeedcoalition.org and all of those wonderful sticky news nuggets. All right, until next time, I'll see you in the newspaper. Episode 115 of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2021 by Lancaster Farming newspaper, which is part of Steinman Communications. Today's show is written and recorded, edited, and produced by Eric Herlock. Any music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.
Industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp.